The security guard's hand closed around his forearm before the boarding door could finish opening. "Sir, you need to step aside. Now." The words cut sharp through the narrow jet bridge, loud enough that several passengers turned. A woman clutched her purse. A man in a blazer slowed his steps. The line behind him stalled tension, spreading like a held breath. Daniel Brooks didn't pull away. He didn't argue. He simply looked down at the guard's hand, then back up at the man's face. "I have a boarding pass," Daniel said quietly. The guard didn't look at it. His eyes stayed fixed on Daniel's worn jacket, the scuffed work boots, the small backpack slung over one shoulder. The kind of bag fathers used when they didn't own luggage sets. "That's not the issue," the guard said. "We got a call." From where Daniel stood, he could see the aircraft door through the glass, the soft glow inside, the flight attendants' waiting smiles frozen. This was a red-eye from Atlanta to Denver. Late. Overbooked. Everyone tired. Everyone ready to go home. Daniel was 49. He worked maintenance for a regional utility company in rural Georgia. Or at least that's what the paperwork said. Tonight, his hands still smelled faintly of oil and cold metal. He hadn't had time to shower before driving straight from a job site to the airport. Behind the guard, a gate agent hovered, lips pressed, thin eyes flicking between Daniel and the growing crowd. Her name tag read Linda. She kept smoothing her blazer again and again. "Sir," she said, forcing politeness into her voice. "There's been a concern raised. We just need to verify a few things." Daniel nodded once. He could feel it now. That familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, recognition. A man 2 spots back in line muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath. Another shook his head, already pulling out his phone. Daniel thought of his daughter Claire, asleep on her stomach, in a twin bed back home, one sock missing like always. She was 11, old enough to notice when her father didn't come home on time, old enough to worry. "It's been a long day," Daniel said. "If we could just—" The guard cut him off. "Step away from the door." The words landed harder this time. Final. Daniel stepped back. The jet bridge felt narrower suddenly. The hum of the plane, the muffled laughter from inside all of it, felt distant. Linda motioned him toward the side wall, away from the line, away from the door. As he moved, his boot caught slightly on the carpet edge. The guard tightened his grip instinctively. Daniel steadied himself without complaint. "Easy," the guard said, though Daniel hadn't done anything. A woman in her 60s, silver hair neatly pinned, spoke up from the line. "He hasn't done anything," she said. Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. "We're all late. Let him on the plane." Linda smiled at her the way people smiled when they wanted you quiet. "Ma'am, we're handling it." The woman's mouth pressed into a line. She said nothing more. Daniel leaned back against the wall. The cold of it seeped through his jacket. He watched the gate agent type rapidly at her terminal. Fingers, sharp, practiced. The guard spoke quietly into his radio voice, low-coded. Daniel didn't need to hear the words. He'd heard versions of them his whole life. Suspicious. Doesn't match the profile. Something feels off. A second security officer arrived. Younger. Broader. He didn't look at Daniel at all. just nodded once to the first guard. Linda cleared her throat. "Sir, do you have any identification besides your boarding pass?" Daniel reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately. He pulled out his wallet, worn leather, softened by years of use. Inside were photos first. Claire at 5 missing teeth. Claire at 8, holding a science fair ribbon. He turned the wallet careful to keep his movements visible and handed over his driver's license. Linda studied it longer than necessary. "Georgia," she said. "You live near Mill Creek?" "Yes." "And your occupation?" she asked, eyes flicking up. "Field operations," Daniel replied. She paused. What kind of field operations? Daniel met her gaze. The kind that keeps the lights on. One corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something else. Behind them, boarding resumed for first class. The line moved. Jackets brushed past. A man in a crisp suit glanced at Daniel, then away. Relief written plainly on his face that this delay was not his problem. The second guard shifted his weight. "We can escort him back to the terminal if needed." "Escort." The word echoed. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He had learned long ago how quickly calm could be mistaken for compliance. "Is there a reason I'm being detained?" he asked. Linda's eyes flicked again to the radio on the counter, then to the boarding door, then back to Daniel. "There was an anonymous tip," she said. "We have to take those seriously." "About what?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. "Long enough." Daniel nodded. That told him everything. A sharp voice cut through the space. "That's enough." Everyone turned. The woman with silver hair had stepped out of line. She was closer now. Eyes bright, jaw set. "You've held this plane for almost 10 minutes. Either you have cause or you don't." Linda stiffened. "Ma'am, please return to no," the woman said. "I buried my husband last year. I'm not in the mood to watch a man get humiliated because someone felt uncomfortable." The jet bridge went quiet. Even the guards paused. Daniel looked at her then. Really looked. Gratitude rose unexpected and sharp. Linda swallowed. "Sir," she said to Daniel, voice clipped. "Now we're going to need you to wait here while we confirm a few things." Daniel nodded again. He had nowhere else to go. As the boarding door began to close, the soft chime echoing down the bridge, something shifted inside him. Not anger. Resolve. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone. The guards stiffened instantly. "It's fine," Daniel said. "I'm making a call." Linda's eyes widened. "Sir, please don't." Daniel already had the phone to his ear. He turned slightly away from them, voice low, controlled. "It's me," he said. "Yes." "Gate B12. They stopped boarding. He listened. His face didn't change, but something in his posture did. His shoulders squared. His breathing steadied. "I need you to stay on the line," he continued, "and patch me through." Linda took an involuntary step forward. "Who are you calling?" Daniel lowered the phone just enough to look at her. "Someone who doesn't like delays," he said. Behind her, the first guard shifted, uncertainty flickering across his face. The radio on Linda's desk crackled suddenly, sharp and loud. "Gate B12, a voice barked. "Hold position. Do not close that door." Linda froze. Daniel lifted the phone back to his ear. His gaze drifted past them through the glass toward the plane he had not yet been allowed to board. The night was far from over. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and the sound cut straight through the jet bridge like a blade. "All personnel at Gate B12. This is operations. Boarding is paused. Repeat. Boarding is paused." Linda's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. The younger guard glanced at her, then at Daniel, then back at the radio as if it might explain itself. The older guard took one step back without realizing he had moved. Passengers inside the aircraft pressed their faces toward the windows, curiosity blooming where impatience had been moments before. A flight attendant leaned out of the door, her practiced smile gone, replaced by a sharp crease between her brows. "What's going on?" she asked. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since Daniel had been stopped, she looked uncertain. "We're just verifying something." Daniel stood with his phone to his ear, listening. He said nothing. His silence did the talking for him. His breathing was slow, deliberate, the kind of calm that came from having already measured the worst possible outcome and accepted it. "Sir," the younger guard said, trying again, softer now. "Who exactly are you on the phone with?" Daniel lowered the phone just enough for his voice to carry. "Someone who signs off on whether this flight leaves on time." The silver-haired woman let out a quiet breath she had been holding. Her eyes flicked from Daniel to Linda, then to the guards. She did not smile, but there was something like satisfaction in the set of her shoulders. Inside the aircraft, a man in the first row stood craning his neck. "We're already late," he called out. "Are we getting off this plane or not?" The flight attendant turned to him. "Please remain seated, sir." Daniel heard a voice come through his phone, low and clipped familiar, in a way that reached back years. "Daniel, tell me exactly what's happening." "They stopped me from boarding," Daniel said. Anonymous tip. No explanation. A pause. Then anyone else involved. 2 security officers, gate supervisor, a crowd, another pause, shorter this time. "Stay where you are." The call ended. Linda's terminal chimed. A message flashed across the screen, and the color drained from her face. She read it once, then again. Her lips parted slightly, as if she meant to say something, but no sound came out. The older guard leaned in. "What is it?" She turned the screen toward him. He stared at it, eyes narrowing, then widening. He straightened, so fast his badge swung forward. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we might have made a mistake." Daniel finally lowered his phone fully. He slipped it back into his jacket pocket, movements unhurried. "I tried to tell you," he said, not unkindly. Linda swallowed. "So, Mr. Brooks, we didn't mean—" The silver-haired woman stepped closer. "You meant exactly what you did," she said. "You just didn't expect anyone to push back." Linda's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, please." "No," the woman replied. "You don't get to please your way out of this." The jet bridge door to the terminal opened, and a man in a dark operations jacket hurried toward them. His pace was brisk, controlled the walk of someone used to crisis. He stopped when he saw Daniel. "Mr. Brooks," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Mark Ellison, Airport Operations." Daniel shook his hand. "Evening." Ellison turned to Linda, his expression all business now. Why was he stopped? Linda glanced at the guards, then back at Ellison. We received an alert. We followed protocol. Ellison's eyes hardened. Protocol requires documentation. Where is it? Linda's silence answered for her. Ellison exhaled through his nose. Reopen the door, he said to the flight attendant. Now. The attendant nodded and stepped back into the aircraft. The door reopened with a muted thud. A ripple of sound passed through the cabin, relief mixed with confusion. Ellison turned back to Daniel. Sir, you are clear to board. Daniel didn't move right away. He looked past Ellison at Linda, at the guards, at the passengers watching from both sides of the glass. My daughter's waiting for me, he said. I don't like delays. Ellison nodded. Understood. As Daniel stepped toward the aircraft, the silver-haired woman touched his arm lightly. Thank you, she said, for not backing down. Daniel met her eyes. Someone has to teach them where the line is. Inside the plane, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations hushed as he walked down the aisle. Some eyes followed him with curiosity, others with something closer to respect. A few looked away, uncomfortable. Daniel reached his seat, placed his backpack beneath it, and sat. The familiar click of the seatbelt grounding him, anchoring him back into his body. Across the aisle, a man leaned over. What was that about? He whispered. Daniel looked out the window as the jet bridge pulled away. A misunderstanding, he said. The engines began to hum louder, a steady vibration through the cabin floor. The lights dimmed. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, smoother now rehearsed. Thank you for your patience. We are preparing for departure. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He saw Claire's face hair fanned across her pillow, the soft rise and fall of her breathing. He imagined her waking in the morning, checking the clock, counting minutes, the way she always did when he traveled. He opened his eyes as the plane began to taxi. Up front, Linda stood frozen at the gate, watching the aircraft move away. Ellison spoke quietly to her words she could not hear, but felt all the same. Consequences had weight. They settled slowly, but they settled deep. In the cockpit, the captain adjusted his headset. Let's get this bird in the air, he said, unaware of how close the flight had come to being delayed for reasons that had nothing to do with weather or mechanics. As the plane lifted off, Daniel felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the momentary surrender to gravity. He exhaled long and slow. The night stretched ahead of them, calm on the surface, hiding the currents beneath. Daniel stared into the dark beyond the window, knowing that this was only the beginning. Somewhere between the ground and the clouds, lines had been crossed, and lines once crossed had a way of demanding answers. The turbulence began without warning, a sharp jolt that snapped trays and sent a ripple of startled gasps through the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed on immediately, followed by a low murmur of unease that spread row by row like a contagion. Daniel's hand tightened around the armrest, not from fear, from recognition. He had felt that kind of movement before. Not turbulence in the casual sense people joked about, but a sudden uneven shift, a loss of rhythm, the aircraft correcting itself just a fraction too late. Across the aisle, the man who had whispered to him earlier muttered a curse and glanced toward the ceiling. A flight attendant steadied herself against a seat back, her smile already gone. The plane lurched again, harder this time. A woman cried out. Somewhere behind Daniel, a child began to wail. Then came the sound. Not loud. Worse than loud, a dull metallic groan that traveled through the cabin floor and up the bones of the aircraft, like something alive and unhappy. Daniel leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the aisle, listening. The intercom crackled. Static first. Then the captain's voice, carefully, even the way men were trained to sound when everything was not fine. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're encountering some unexpected air movement. Our crew is assessing the situation." Unexpected air movement. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Across the aisle, the whispering man laughed nervously. "That didn't sound rehearsed," he said. Daniel didn't answer. He tilted his head, listening past the words, past the tone, searching for what wasn't being said. He noticed how the engine sounded slightly uneven, now the subtle change in pitch that most people would never catch. A flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, hands out, palms open, the universal gesture of calm. Her eyes, though, betrayed her. They flicked upward toward the cockpit again and again. The plane shuddered a third time. This time, the overhead bins rattled. A man 3 rows ahead stood despite the sign. "Hey," he called out, his voice edged with irritation. "What's going on up there, sir?" "Please take your seat," the attendant said, sharper now. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. He saw a different cabin, different seats, different decade. A younger version of himself, strapped in tight, waiting for a checklist to finish running while alarms screamed in the background. He opened his eyes as the plane leveled out slightly. The intercom chimed again. The captain's voice returned more deliberate. "We're working through a systems issue. Everything is under control." Systems issue. Plural. Daniel felt his pulse pick up slow and heavy in his throat. He didn't move, didn't speak. He knew better than to rush a moment like this. Panic came from people who tried to get ahead of the facts. Around him, the cabin buzzed with low conversation now. Questions, speculation. Phones held tight but useless in airplane mode. The silver-haired woman from the gate leaned into the aisle. "You okay?" she asked Daniel quietly. He met her eyes. Not sure yet. She nodded once, understanding more than he'd said. Another jolt hit, not violent, but insistent, like the plane was fighting something unseen. The engine surged, then settled. The intercom clicked. This time, it wasn't the captain. "Flight attendants to the cockpit," a voice said. Not panicked, but urgent. 2 attendants exchanged a look. One nodded, lips pressed tight, and moved quickly toward the front. The other turned to the cabin, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Everyone, please stay seated." Daniel watched the first attendant disappear behind the cockpit door. Minutes stretched, the lights dimmed slightly, then brightened again. A man in first class scoffed. "This airline," he muttered. "Every time." Daniel's jaw tightened. The intercom crackled again. This time, the captain didn't bother with pleasantries. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are addressing a technical malfunction related to flight control sensors. Our aircraft is safe, but we may experience additional turbulence." Flight control sensors. Daniel felt the weight of the words settle into his chest. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then down at his hands. They were steady. The plane dipped suddenly more sharply than before. A scream tore through the cabin. Overhead lights flickered. A few oxygen masks trembled, but did not deploy. The man in first class went silent. Daniel leaned forward, bracing his feet, feeling the way the aircraft responded. The correction came late. Too late. The attendant returned from the cockpit, face pale beneath her makeup. She didn't smile this time. She moved with purpose, checking seat belts, her voice low but firm. Daniel caught her eye as she passed, just for a moment. She looked away first. That told him everything. He unbuckled his seatbelt halfway, then stopped. Not yet. The captain's voice came again, stripped of warmth now. If there is anyone on board with experience in aviation systems or manual aircraft handling, please make yourself known to a member of the cabin crew. The cabin went still. You could feel it, the collective intake of breath. The question hung there, heavy, undeniable. A man 2 rows up half stood, then hesitated. Eyes darting. He sat back down. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else whispered a prayer. Daniel closed his eyes. Claire's face came to him instantly. Her laugh, the way she kicked her shoes off by the door, the way she pretended not to worry when he traveled. He opened his eyes and looked straight ahead. He did not stand. Not yet. The request came again, this time more specific, especially those with military or high-performance aircraft experience. Daniel's chest tightened. His fingers curled slowly. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman turned toward him, eyes sharp now. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Another jolt rocked the plane, harder, the kind that made bones protest. A man farther back shouted, "What the hell is happening?" Daniel inhaled, deep, controlled. He unbuckled his seatbelt fully and stood. The movement drew eyes instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The flight attendant near him froze, then turned. "I can help," Daniel said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The attendant stared at him, shock flickering across her face, followed quickly by suspicion. "Sir, please sit down." Daniel met her gaze. "You asked for experience." Her eyes dropped to his jacket, his boots, his hands. "Do you have credentials?" "Not on me." The whispering started immediately. Sharp, ugly. A man scoffed. "Of course," he said. "Anyone can say that." Daniel ignored him. He kept his eyes on the attendant. "I flew military aircraft for over 20 years. I've dealt with sensor failures, degraded controls, bad data, feeding good systems. I know what this feels like." The attendant's jaw tightened. She hesitated, torn between protocol and fear. Another flight attendant hurried up, breathless. "The captain wants anyone with relevant experience brought forward," she said. Then she saw Daniel. Her eyes flicked to his face, then away. "Sir," she said, carefully, "we'll need to verify." "There's no time," Daniel said quietly. "And you know it." The aircraft shuddered again, the longest yet. The overhead lights dimmed once more. In the cockpit, something heavy hit metal. Daniel didn't wait for permission. He stepped forward, past the attendant toward the front of the plane, the weight of the cabin's gaze pressing into his back. Somewhere behind him, someone said, "He doesn't even look like a pilot." Daniel kept walking. This was no longer about how he looked. This was about whether everyone on this plane would see the ground again. The cockpit door did not open right away. Daniel stood in the narrow aisle, gripping the seat backs as the aircraft rocked beneath his feet, every movement amplified now that he was standing. The smell of recycled air felt thicker here, heavier, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. "So you can't be up here," the flight attendant said again, her voice tighter this time. She positioned herself half a step in front of him, not blocking him completely but not letting him pass either. Her name tag read Allison. Her hand hovered near the intercom panel, fingers trembling despite her effort to keep them still. "I'm not here to cause a problem," Daniel said. His voice cut clean through the noise. Calm. Low. "I'm here because you have one." Another jolt slammed through the fuselage. The plane dipped hard enough that Allison stumbled back a step. Daniel reached out instinctively and steadied her by the elbow. She flinched at the contact, then froze, surprised by the firmness, the control in his grip. From behind the cockpit door came raised voices. One sharp, one strained. A metallic clatter followed like something dropped and kicked aside. Allison swallowed. "Captain," she called. No answer. The intercom crackled to life before she could try again. The first officer's voice came through younger, tighter, stripped of polish. "We need assistance up here. Now." Allison's eyes widened. She looked at Daniel again. Really looked this time. Not at his clothes, not at his age. At his eyes, at the way he hadn't moved when the plane lurched, the way his weight stayed centered, grounded. She stepped aside. Daniel didn't rush. He never rushed. He took one breath, then reached for the cockpit door handle. Inside the air was hotter, louder. Screens flickered across the instrument panel, some glowing, steady, others flashing amber and red. The captain was slumped in his seat, head tilted unnaturally to one side, blood seeping through his hairline. An oxygen mask dangled loose, forgotten. The first officer sat rigid in the right seat, hands locked around the yoke knuckles, white jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He looked barely older than Daniel's daughter would be in a decade. "Captains down," the first officer said, words spilling fast. "We hit severe turbulence right as we lost reliable input from the angle of attack sensors. Autopilot kicked off. The trim went crazy. I'm fighting it." Daniel stepped closer, eyes scanning the panel, taking everything in at once. "What's your name, Evan?" the first officer said. "Evan Miller." "Okay, Evan," Daniel said. "You're doing fine. You're still flying the plane." Evan let out a breath that sounded more like a sob than a laugh. "Doesn't feel like it." Daniel glanced at the captain, checked his pulse with 2 fingers, quick and efficient. "He's alive," Daniel said. "Concussed. Focus stays here." Another alarm chimed. High, insistent. Daniel leaned in, pointing. "That reading's wrong." Evan blinked. "What, that sensor's feeding garbage," Daniel said. "Plane's not stalling. It just thinks it is. You're chasing bad data." Evan stared at the display, then back at Daniel. "How do you know that?" "Because if it were right, we'd already be dead." The words landed heavy, but they steadied Evan more than panic ever could. His breathing slowed. Just a little. "Listen to me," Daniel said. "Ignore that indicator. Fly attitude and power. Pitch thrust. Trust what you feel, not what that screen's screaming at you." Evan hesitated. "That goes against procedure." So does losing control at 35,000 feet, Daniel replied. This isn't the manual anymore. The plane bucked again, a sharp, downward lurch that sent Evan's shoulder slamming into his harness. He cursed under his breath. Daniel braced himself, feet planted wide, one hand on the back of the captain's seat. His mind slid into a place he hadn't visited in years. Quiet, focused. The outside world narrowed to instruments, sound vibration. When was the last stable reading, Daniel asked. 10 minutes ago, Evan said. Then it started drifting. And the backup, showing the same thing. Daniel nodded. Common mode failure. Same bad input feeding both. Evan swallowed. So what do we do? Daniel met his gaze. We take the computers out of the argument. Silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of the engines and the intermittent alarms. You mean manual? Evan asked. I mean simplified control, Daniel said. Reduced protections, heavier feel, less help, but honest feedback. Evan's hands tightened. I've only done that in the simulator. Daniel placed a steady hand on Evan's shoulder. Not heavy, just enough. Simulators teach muscle memory, he said. Fear teaches respect. You've got both right now. Outside the cockpit, the cabin had gone eerily quiet. Passengers sensed the shift the invisible line crossed when voices from the front changed tone. A baby cried, then went silent. Someone prayed aloud, not caring who heard. Allison hovered just outside the door, eyes darting between the cockpit and the aisle. What do you need? She asked. Time, Daniel said without turning. And quiet. She nodded and closed the cockpit door, sealing them off from the cabin. Daniel pointed again. Disengage the faulty system. Don't fight the trim. Let it settle. Evan did as told, hands shaking but precise. The yoke resisted heavy, now stubborn. There, Daniel said. Feel that? That's the plane talking to you, not the computer. The alarms softened fewer now. The plane leveled slightly, still uneasy, but no longer thrashing. Evan let out a shaky breath. It's responding. Daniel allowed himself the smallest nod. Good. That means we bought ourselves some time. How much? Evan asked. Daniel looked at the fuel state, the altitude, the storm cells building on the radar. He did the math without thinking. Enough, he said. If we don't waste it. Evan glanced at him. You sound very sure. Daniel thought of Claire again, of the promise he had made when he buried her mother. Of every night he had chosen home over the sky. I'm sure of one thing, he said quietly. We're not giving up. Another alarm chirped lower now, almost cautious. Daniel straightened. Okay, he said. Now we start making decisions that matter. Somewhere far behind them, the passengers waited unaware that the line between routine flight and disaster had already been crossed, and that the man they had almost left behind at the gate was now standing between them and the dark below. The first thing Daniel noticed was the smell. Not smoke, not yet. Something sharper, electrical. The kind of scent that lived just beneath the surface of modern machines, waiting for an excuse to announce itself. Do you smell that? Evan asked, eyes flicking to the overhead panel. Daniel nodded. Yeah? That's not coming from the engines. Another warning light blinked on amber this time. Evan's shoulders tensed. "Electrical bus instability," he said. "We lose enough of that, and half these screens go dark." Daniel leaned closer, steadying himself as the plane shuddered again. "How's the standby power?" "Still there," Evan said. "But it's not meant to carry this load for long." Daniel straightened slowly. His mind ran ahead, not panicking, just mapping. Systems on systems, redundancies designed by committees that never expected this many failures to stack at once. "We're flying," Daniel said. "That's the priority. Everything else is noise." Evan let out a thin laugh. "You say that like it's simple." "It is," Daniel replied. "Not easy. Simple." Another vibration rolled through the fuselage, lower this time, like a deep groan. The plane held, but barely. Outside the cockpit, the cabin was no longer quiet. The hush had cracked. Murmurs grew into voices. Allison's voice cut through them, calm but firm, repeating the same instructions again and again. Daniel turned slightly. "We need to talk about where we're going." Evan swallowed. "Denver's out. We can't cross the Rockies like this." "Agreed. And turning back to Atlanta puts us right through the worst of the weather system." Daniel glanced at the navigation display. "What about north?" Evan followed his gaze. His brow furrowed. "That limits our options." "Sometimes limited options are cleaner," Daniel said. Another alarm chirped, then fell silent, like it had second thoughts. Evan exhaled. "There's a long runway in northern Canada. Cold, flat, minimal terrain." Daniel nodded. "Cold air helps performance. Less density issues." "But it's remote," Evan added. "Not much support." Daniel met his eyes. "Support doesn't matter if we don't get there." Silence settled between them. Not empty. Heavy with calculation. Evan tapped the screen, bringing up weather overlays. "Winds are strong. Crosswind component will be ugly." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I've landed in worse." Evan looked at him. "I haven't." Daniel didn't soften his voice. He didn't need to. "You don't need to be perfect," he said. "You need to be present." The cockpit shook again. Harder. A jolt that rattled the overhead panels. Allison's voice came through the intercom, strained now. "Passengers are asking questions." Daniel reached for the radio. "Let them ask. Don't let them panic." Evan hesitated. "What do we tell them?" Daniel thought for a moment. "The truth, without the fear." Evan nodded slowly and keyed the mic. His voice carried into the cabin, steady but honest. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a systems malfunction that requires us to divert. The aircraft remains under control. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." A pause. Then softer. "We're doing everything we need to do." Daniel closed his eyes briefly as Evan spoke. Not because he was tired, because he was remembering. A different voice, a different cockpit, a different promise. He opened his eyes to the present as a new sound joined the chorus. A rhythmic thump. Subtle, unforgiving. Evan heard it too. "That's not turbulence." "No," Daniel said. That's structural stress talking back. Evan's hands tightened. How much margin do we have? Daniel didn't answer right away. He checked the numbers again. Fuel, weight, altitude, temperature. Every variable stacked just so. Enough, he said again. But it's shrinking. Outside the cockpit, tension snapped. A man's voice rose above the others, sharp with accusation. Why is some passenger up there flying the plane? Daniel felt it like a punch to the gut, not because of the words, but because of the timing. Allison's reply was firm. Sir, please sit down. I want to know who's in charge, the man snapped. This is ridiculous. Daniel leaned closer to the door, listening. You don't even know his name, the man continued. This is insane. Daniel felt Evan stiffen beside him. Should I say something? Daniel shook his head. No. The thumping grew louder. Evan's eyes darted to the panel. We're losing another bus. A screen went black. Then another. The cockpit dimmed, the glow reduced to a handful of essential displays. Daniel didn't hesitate. All right, that's our cue. For what Evan asked. Daniel met his gaze. For me to take the seat. Evan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the yoke, then at the darkened screens, then back at Daniel. That's not procedure. Neither is this situation, Daniel said. You're overloaded. You've been fighting this since the first alarm. Let me carry it for a while. Evan hesitated. Every rule, every training hour, every voice in his head told him this was wrong. Another jolt hit, throwing them forward against their harnesses. Evan cursed as the yoke jerked violently. Daniel didn't move. His stance absorbed it. Decision time, he said quietly. Evan stared at him. For a long second, fear and pride wrestled inside his chest. Then something else won. Trust. Or maybe necessity. Okay, Evan said. His voice cracked. You have the aircraft. Daniel slid into the captain's seat. It fit him like memory. His hands closed around the yoke, not squeezing, just resting. Feeling. I have control, he said. The plane responded. Not smoothly, but honestly. Daniel adjusted pitch by feel power by sound. He ignored the dead screens. He listened to the air, to the vibration in the frame, to the subtle resistance pushing back through the controls. Evan watched, awed and terrified all at once. How are you so calm? Daniel didn't look at him. I'm not, he said. I'm just not letting it drive. The cabin noise rose again, a swell of fear and anger mixing together. Allison's voice wavered as she tried to maintain order. Daniel keyed the mic. Allison. Yes, she replied immediately. Tell the cabin we're diverting north. Tell them it's precautionary. Tell them we're flying manually to preserve system stability. A pause. They're going to ask who you are. Daniel swallowed. Just once. Tell them I'm a pilot who came home to be a father, and tonight that means making sure everyone else gets home, too. The line went quiet. Evan looked at him. You didn't have to say that. Daniel's eyes stayed forward. Yes, he said softly. I did. The plane groaned again, but it held. For now. Far below them, darkness stretched endless and indifferent. Ahead, a narrow path of cold air and long concrete waited. Daniel tightened his grip just enough. This flight was no longer about schedules or reputations. It was about hands-on controls, truth over comfort, and whether resolve could outlast metal. And time was no longer on their side. The aircraft groaned as if it understood the choice that had just been made. Not a single dramatic lurch, just a long, aching sound that traveled through the frame into the controls into Daniel's hands. He eased the yoke forward a fraction, then held it there. The response came late, but it came. Honest, heavy, alive. "Pitch is stable," Evan said, eyes darting between the remaining displays. "Airspeed's holding." "Barely." "Barely is enough," Daniel replied. The lights flickered again. The cockpit dimmed to a muted glow, like a room lit by a dying lamp. Outside the windows, the night was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just black layered over black. Daniel glanced at the clock. Not the numbers, the seconds, the rhythm of them. Time was no longer something to spend. It was something to ration. "How long before we lose another bus?" he asked. Evan swallowed. "Hard to say. Could be minutes, could be an hour." Daniel nodded. "Then we fly like it's minutes." He adjusted the throttles by sound, not sight. Listening to the engine settle into a rough harmony. The vibration through the yoke softened slightly. Not better. Just different. In the cabin, the tension finally broke the surface. Voices rose, not screaming yet, but close. Fear searching for something to grab onto. A man's voice cut through the noise, sharp and indignant. "This is unacceptable. Someone explain why a passenger is flying this plane." Daniel heard it clearly through the thin cockpit door. He felt Evan stiffen beside him. Allison's voice followed, strained but controlled. "Sir, please take your seat. This is a safety issue." "I want answers," the man insisted. "I paid for this flight." Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. He saw a different man, different place, same tone. Authority assumed, not earned. "Let him talk," Daniel said quietly. Evan turned. "What?" "Let him burn himself out," Daniel said. "Anger takes energy. Fear takes focus. We need the focus." Another tremor rippled through the plane. Subtle, but it carried a warning. Evan checked the pressure readings again. Hydraulics are dropping faster now. Daniel felt it in the controls before Evan finished speaking. The yoke resisted more. The plane was growing stubborn, like an animal tiring under load. "All right," Daniel said. "We start preparing them." Evan frowned. "Preparing for what?" "For a landing that won't feel normal," Daniel replied. He reached for the radio. "Center, this is Flight 782. We are diverting north due to multiple system degradations. We are flying with reduced automation and limited hydraulics." The controller's voice came back, calm, practiced. "Flight 782 copy. We have you. Say your intentions." Daniel didn't hesitate. "We need a long runway. Cold weather is preferable. Minimal terrain. Emergency services standing by." A pause. Then stand by. The seconds stretched. In the cabin, the man's voice rose again. "You can't just trust him. This is insane." "Look at him." Daniel opened his eyes. His jaw tightened. Not in anger, in resolve. Allison's voice cut in sharper now. "Sir, if you do not sit down, you will be restrained." That earned a chorus of reactions. Some gasps, some murmurs of agreement, others silent, watching. Daniel imagined the faces. Older couples gripping hands, parents pulling children closer. People who had lived long enough to know that control was an illusion and still needed to believe in it. The radio crackled again. Flight 78. "To nearest suitable airport is Churchill. Long runway, cold. Winds are within limits. Emergency services can be staged." Daniel nodded. "We'll take it." Evan looked at him. "That's tight." "Tight is fine," Daniel said. "Impossible is not." He adjusted their heading. The plane resisted, then complied, slow and heavy. Sweat beaded at his temples unnoticed. Evan watched his hands. "You're not fighting it." Daniel shook his head. "You don't fight something that weighs this much. You persuade it." Another alarm chirped, then went dead. One more system, giving up quietly. Evan's voice dropped. "We're losing flight envelope protections." "I know," Daniel said. "Which means every mistake belongs to us now." The words hung there. No comfort in them. Just truth. The man in the cabin shouted again, desperation creeping into his anger. "This is how people die, trusting the wrong person." Daniel leaned closer to the cockpit door and spoke his voice low but carrying. "Sir." The cabin went still. "I don't need your trust," Daniel continued. "I need your cooperation. Sit down. Buckle up. Let us work." Silence followed. Thick, uncomfortable. Someone else spoke, then. An older woman's voice. Calm, firm. "Sit down," she said to the man. "You're not helping." A pause, then the sound of a seatbelt clicking. Daniel exhaled slowly. Evan glanced at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Daniel said again. "I did." The plane shuddered as they began their gradual descent. Not yet steep, just enough to feel. Daniel rolled his shoulders, feeling the strain building there. This was not a fighter. This was not forgiving. Every correction cost muscle now. Every degree demanded effort. "How are you holding up?" Evan asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought of Claire, of her hands, always warm, always reaching, of the way she looked at him like the world made sense as long as he was in it. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said finally. The descent continued. The air grew denser, the controls heavier. Daniel's forearms burned slow and deep. "Hydraulics at 50%, Evan said. Daniel nodded. "Call it every 5. Understood." The runway lights were still far away. Just a concept. A promise. In the cabin, Allison's voice came over the intercom, steadier now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing earlier than expected. Please review the safety card and remain seated. No reassurances, no lies, just instructions." Daniel respected that. Another tremor shook the plane. Stronger, the kind that rattled teeth. 45%, Evan said. Daniel adjusted compensating breathing through the strain. He felt the plane sag slightly, then recover. "We're still flying," he said. Evan nodded. "We're still flying." Outside, the darkness thinned, just barely. A suggestion of cloud texture, depth returning to the world. Daniel leaned forward, eyes locked ahead. He had crossed a line back there, stepping into a role he had promised himself he was done with. But this wasn't about the sky calling him back. It was about gravity, demanding respect. Another voice came through the radio. "Flight 782, emergency crews are standing by. You are cleared for approach." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest loosen just a little. "Thank you," he said. "We're coming in hot." The words were not dramatic. They were accurate. He flexed his fingers once, then tightened his grip. This was no longer about whether he belonged here. That question had already been answered by the weight in his hands, by the plane responding, because it had no other choice. Ahead of them, the runway waited, long, cold, unforgiving, and Daniel Brooks flew toward it with everything he had left. The runway appeared as a thin line of white against the black, too distant to be real, like something drawn on glass, rather than poured from concrete and steel. Daniel kept his eyes on it anyway. He did not chase it. He let it come to him. "Hydraulics at 40%, Evan said. His voice was steady, now stripped down to function. "Copy," Daniel replied. He adjusted power by a fraction, listening more than looking. The engines answered with a low growl, uneven but loyal. The aircraft shook again, not violently but insistently, as if reminding them that the margin they were borrowing was not theirs to keep. Daniel's forearms burned. The yoke resisted every movement, now heavy as wet clay. "Wind's shifting," Evan said. "Crosswind from the left. Increasing." Daniel nodded. "We'll take it." "You're sure?" "No," Daniel said. "But I'm ready." Below them, the ground rose slowly, the darkness giving way to texture. Snow-dusted fields, sparse lights, the world returning in pieces. In the cabin, Allison's voice came over the intercom, controlled but tight. "Brace position, everyone. Heads down when instructed. Follow crew commands." A murmur swept through the passengers. Seatbelts tightened. Hands gripped armrests. Someone began to cry quietly, the sound thin and contained. The man who had shouted earlier said nothing now. He stared straight ahead, face pale, mouth slightly open. The anger burned out of him, and leaving only fear behind. Daniel felt the change in the air before the instruments confirmed it. Thicker. Heavier. The plane responded slower now, like it was wading through resistance. 35%, Evan said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "All right. From here on, we commit." He lined them up carefully. Shallow approach, faster than any manual would recommend. But speed was control now. Without it, they would drop. Hard. "Altitude," Daniel said. 2,000 feet, Evan replied. "Stable." The runway lights grew brighter, sharper. Individual vehicles along the edge became visible. Emergency trucks, flashing beacons, people waiting. Daniel felt sweat run down his spine, cold despite the heat in the cockpit. His breathing stayed even. In, out. He blocked everything else. Another alarm chirped weakly, then went silent as if embarrassed to interrupt. 30%, Evan said. Daniel adjusted rudder, feeling the lag compensating early. The plane drifted, corrected, drifted again. Easy, he murmured, not to Evan, not to the aircraft, but to himself. The cabin felt the descent now, the pressure change, the speed. Some passengers pressed their heads back, eyes closed. Others leaned forward, drawn helplessly toward the unknown ahead. The silver-haired woman clasped her hands together, not praying exactly, but focusing, anchoring herself. Altitude, Daniel said. 1,000 feet, gear down and locked. Evan confirmed. At least the indicators say they are. Daniel didn't respond. He would find out soon enough. The wind shoved them sideways, sudden and sharp. Daniel counted muscles, straining, timing everything by instinct and experience, rather than numbers. 25%, Evan said. His voice wavered just for a second. Daniel felt it. The controls were becoming stubborn, almost unresponsive. Each correction demanded commitment now. No finesse left, just strength and judgment. Eyes outside, Daniel said. Call the runway. Centered, Evan replied, drifting left, correcting. Daniel adjusted, feeling the plane protest. He held it, refusing to overcorrect, trusting the delayed response. In the cabin, Allison shouted, "Brace, brace, brace." Passengers folded forward, arms over heads. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. 500 feet, Evan said. You're high. I know, Daniel said. I need the speed. The runway rushed toward them now, the lights blinding after the darkness. Daniel could see the painted numbers, the rubber marks from 1,000 landings before this one. 400. The plane shuddered violently, a deep vibration tearing through the frame. Hydraulics at 20%, Evan said. We're losing authority. Daniel's voice hardened. We're landing. 300. Daniel shifted his weight forward, muscles screaming. He adjusted power, feeling the engines answer sluggishly. 200. The controls went heavy. Almost dead, Daniel Evans said. I know, Daniel replied. His teeth clenched. He pulled back, slow and relentless, refusing to give the plane a choice. Brace Evan shouted into the cabin mic. The runway filled the windows. 100. Daniel pulled harder now, every fiber in his arms engaged. The plane resisted, nose sluggish, refusing to flare the way it should. Come on, Daniel whispered. Not a plea, a command. 50 feet. The main gear slammed down, not gracefully but squarely. The impact roared through the aircraft, a violent jolt that snapped heads and rattled teeth. A second bounce threatened the plane, lifting just enough to scare, then settling back with a shriek of rubber on concrete. Daniel slammed the thrust reversers. The engines howled. The plane shook like it was tearing itself apart. Brakes, Evan shouted. Daniel stood on them. Hard. The aircraft decelerated in fits and starts. Every vibration, magnified every second, stretched thin. The end of the runway rushed closer. Lights, snow, darkness beyond. Hold, Daniel said through clenched teeth. Hold. The plane slowed. 50 knots, 30, 20. Then finally, blessedly, it stopped. Silence crashed into the cockpit, heavy and unreal. Daniel's hands stayed on the yoke. His chest heaved once, twice. He didn't move. Evan stared at the instruments, then out of the window, then back at Daniel. We're down. Daniel closed his eyes. In the cabin, the silence broke into sound. Crying. Laughter. Shouts. People sobbing into strangers' shoulders, gripping each other like they might float away if they let go. Allison sank into an empty seat, tears streaming down her face, hands shaking now that she no longer had to hold them still. The man who had shouted earlier stared at the floor, face grey, words gone. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft lights, flashing engines idling. Doors opened. Cold air rushed in. Evan finally unbuckled his harness, hands trembling. You did it, he said. You actually did it. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at him. We did, he said quietly. Evan swallowed hard. They're going to ask who you are. Daniel leaned back in the seat, exhaustion flooding him all at once. He thought of Claire, of her small hand in his, of the promise he had made without knowing a night like this would ever come. They can ask, he said. Right now, everyone's alive. That's enough. Outside, responders rushed forward. Inside, lives slowly returned to themselves. And somewhere between the cockpit and the cabin, between judgment and gratitude, the truth about Daniel Brooks waited patient and unyielding, ready to be seen whether anyone was prepared for it or not. The cold hit Daniel the moment the cockpit door opened, sharp and clean, slicing through the heat and metal smell that still clung to his clothes. Emergency lights washed the runway, in white and red, flashing across the windows like a heartbeat finally slowing down. Evan unstrapped first legs, unsteady as he stood. He paused, turned back, and looked at Daniel like he was afraid the moment would vanish if he didn't acknowledge it. I don't think I could have done that alone, he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. You didn't. Outside voices overlapped, commands, radios crackling, the low rumble of engines idling. The door to the cabin opened, and sound poured in raw, human, uncontrolled. Crying. Laughter that sounded almost hysterical. People calling out names, checking if someone was still there. Allison pushed into the cockpit, her composure finally gone. Tears streaked her face, but her posture stayed upright. Professional muscle memory, refusing to let her collapse yet. Everyone's alive, she said. Her voice broke on the last word. Every single one. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly. Release. He closed his eyes and let his head rest back against the seat for just a second. When he opened them again, a man in a heavy jacket stood in the doorway, reflective stripes catching the emergency lights. Airport operations. Authority in his stance, but also something else. Respect maybe, or caution. Sir, the man said, looking at Daniel, we need you to come with us once the captain is stabilized. Daniel nodded. Of course. They moved the captain first, carefully, voices low, efficient. The cockpit emptied slowly after that. Evan lingered unsure what to do with his hands, his eyes never leaving Daniel. They're going to investigate everything, Evan said. FAA airline, the whole thing. Daniel stood, legs stiff, muscles protesting now that the work was done. They should. Evan hesitated. You're not worried, Daniel met his gaze. I didn't do this for permission. The word stayed with Evan as responders guided Daniel out of the cockpit and down the narrow aisle. The cabin fell quiet as he passed, the noise fading into a heavy, collective stillness. Faces turned toward him, some streaked with tears, some pale and hollow, some wide-eyed, searching for something they couldn't quite name. A woman reached out and touched his sleeve, just for a second. Thank you, she whispered, as if speaking louder might break the moment. Another man nodded, jaw tight, eyes wet. Someone pressed a small wooden cross into Daniel's palm without a word. He accepted them all with the same stillness. No speeches, no explanations. He kept moving. Near the exit, the silver-haired woman stood waiting, hands clasped in front of her. When Daniel reached her, she looked up at him, eyes shining. I told them at the gate, she said softly. I said they were wrong about you. Daniel gave a faint smile. You didn't owe me that. I owed myself, she replied. The stairs down to the runway were cold beneath his boots. Snow crunched underfoot. The air smelled like fuel and ice and relief. A small group of officials waited near the base of the stairs. Suits, radios, clipboards. One of them stepped forward, extending a hand. Daniel Brooks. Yes, I'm Thomas Keller, Regional Director for the airline. His grip was firm, practiced. On behalf of the company and everyone on that aircraft. Thank you. Daniel shook his hand. You should thank your crew. They held it together. Keller nodded, then hesitated. We weren't aware of your background. Daniel's expression didn't change. That's not unusual. A few steps away, the man who had shouted earlier stood alone, arms wrapped around himself, like he was cold despite his coat. He watched Daniel with an expression caught somewhere between shame and disbelief. Daniel felt his gaze and turned toward him. The man swallowed. I was wrong, he said. His voice trembled. What I said. The way I said it. Daniel waited. I thought. The man stopped, shook his head. I thought I knew what a pilot looked like. Daniel studied him for a long moment. The runway lights reflected off the man's eyes, making them look older than they probably were. People usually do, Daniel said quietly. That's how they miss the truth. The man nodded, tears spilling now. I'm sorry. Daniel held his gaze, then gave a single nod. Learn from it. He turned away before the man could say anything else. They brought Daniel into a small operations room near the runway. Bright lights, folding chairs, a table with lukewarm coffee and paper cups. The contrast was jarring after the night sky and the cockpit. Questions came, but not all at once. Names, background, experience. Daniel answered calmly, precisely. No embellishment, no defensiveness. Between questions, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway, fingers stiff as he unlocked the screen. A missed call, a voicemail. He pressed play. Dad. Claire's voice said soft and sleepy. Grandma said your plane landed somewhere weird. Are you okay? Daniel's throat tightened. He leaned against the wall, eyes closing. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he whispered into the phone. "I'm okay. I'll call you soon." When he returned to the room, the questions slowed, then stopped. One of the officials cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "you're free to go. We'll be in touch." Daniel stood, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The adrenaline was gone now, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. Outside, dawn crept across the horizon, pale and fragile. The aircraft sat silent on the runway behind him, scarred but whole. Daniel looked back at it once. Just once. Then he turned toward the terminal, toward warmth, toward a phone call he needed to make, carrying with him the weight of what had been done, and the quiet certainty that when the moment came, he had chosen to stand. Not for praise, not for recognition, but because some lines, once crossed, demand a response. Morning arrived quietly, as if it did not want to disturb what the night had taken from everyone involved. Daniel sat alone near the terminal windows, a paper cup of coffee cooling between his hands, watching pale light stretch across the frozen tarmac. The plane was still there, ringed by vehicles and officials, its nose darkened with streaks of melted ice and rubber. It looked smaller now, less threatening, like something that had spent all its fury and come to rest. People moved around him in clusters, passengers wrapped in blankets, crew members speaking in low voices. No one was rushing anymore. That alone felt unreal. Footsteps approached. Daniel did not look up right away. He recognized the rhythm. "You should be sleeping," Evan said. Daniel glanced over. Evan stood there with 2 cups of coffee eyes, bloodshot shoulders, slumped. The adrenaline that had kept him upright for hours was gone, leaving behind the tremor of delayed shock. "I will," Daniel said. "Later." Evan handed him a fresh cup and sat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. They watched a de-icing truck crawl past the aircraft like an insect. "They're already calling it a miracle," Evan said finally. Daniel took a slow sip. "Miracles don't have checklists." Evan huffed a quiet laugh, then sobered. "They're replaying everything in my head upstairs. Every switch. Every second." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I keep thinking about the moment I gave you the controls. You didn't give me anything," Daniel said. "You made a decision. That decision could end my career." Daniel turned to him. "Or define it." Evan looked down. "I broke procedure." "You followed judgment," Daniel replied. "That's what keeps procedure honest." Evan nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. Across the terminal, raised voices cut through the hum. Daniel didn't need to see to know who it was. The man from the cabin stood near the airline desk, gesturing sharply. His words clipped and defensive. 2 other passengers watched from a distance, arms crossed. Daniel felt Evan tense beside him. "That guy again," Evan muttered. "Unbelievable." Daniel rose slowly. His body protested muscles, stiff and sore, but he ignored it. "Stay here," he said. Evan watched him go, unease written across his face. Daniel approached calmly, stopping just close enough to be heard without intruding. He didn't raise his voice. The man noticed him mid-sentence and froze. His face flushed color rising up his neck. "I wasn't," the man began. Daniel lifted a hand not to silence him, but to steady the moment. "You don't owe me an explanation," he said. "But you might owe yourself one." The man swallowed hard. I thought if something went wrong, someone should be accountable. Daniel nodded. That's fair. I just didn't expect. The man stopped, words tangling. I didn't expect you. Daniel held his gaze. Most people don't. The silence between them drew attention. Nearby conversations softened curiosity, pulling focus like gravity. I was scared, the man said, finally. And I said things. Yes, Daniel replied. You did. The man's shoulders sagged. I'm trying to understand how I missed it. Daniel considered him for a long moment. You didn't miss it, he said. You filtered it. The man blinked. Filtered. Through assumptions. Daniel continued. About what competence looks like. About who belongs where. Filters feel like instincts. That's why they're dangerous. The man's eyes shone. He nodded once. I don't want my kids to think like that. Then don't teach them, Daniel said. He turned away before the moment could sour or soften too much. Back at the window, Evan watched him return. You didn't have to do that. Daniel sat again, easing into the chair. I know. Evan studied him. How do you stay so even? Daniel stared out at the runway. Because I used to be angry all the time, he said. It almost cost me everything. Evan waited. My wife used to say anger was loud because it was afraid no one would listen. Daniel continued. After she died, I realized the only voice that mattered was the one my daughter heard. Evan nodded slowly. As if summoned by the thought, Daniel's phone buzzed. He answered on the second ring. Hey, sweetheart. Claire's voice came through bright but tight. Dad, are you really on the news? Daniel smiled, despite himself. Looks like it. Grandma says you helped land the plane. I helped, he said. Other people did the hard parts. There was a pause. Were you scared? Daniel looked at the sky, now streaked with soft gold. Yes, he said, honestly. But I knew why I was there. Claire exhaled a sound halfway between relief and pride. When are you coming home? Soon, Daniel said. Very soon. Okay, she said. I made pancakes with Grandma. I saved you one. Daniel closed his eyes. That might be the bravest thing anyone's done all day. She laughed, the sound light and clear. I love you, Dad. I love you too. When the call ended, Daniel stayed still for a long moment, letting the sound of her voice anchor him back to the ground. Evan cleared his throat. The FAA wants a formal statement later. Airline 2. Daniel nodded. That's fine. They're also talking about recognizing you. Publicly. Daniel frowned slightly. For what Evan blinked. For saving everyone. Daniel shook his head. That wasn't the point. Evan studied him. Then what was Daniel leaned back, eyes closing briefly. Coming home. Around them, the terminal continued to wake up. News crews gathered at a distance. Phones came out. Whispers followed him now, wherever he moved. But Daniel stayed where he was, watching the light shift across the snow, feeling the weight of the night finally begin to lift. The plane would be repaired. Reports would be written. Opinions would harden and soften in cycles. But for him, the truth was simpler. He had been judged. He had been doubted. He had been tested, and when it mattered, he had answered not with anger or pride, but with presence. That was what would last. Not the headlines, not the arguments, just the quiet certainty that when the moment came, he had chosen correctly. And that was enough. Daniel boarded the connecting flight home, without ceremony, slipping into his seat like any other tired traveler, the kind people looked past without thinking twice. The airline had upgraded him to first class, a quiet decision made by someone in an office far away. But Daniel barely noticed. He slept through most of the flight, a deep, unbroken sleep that came only when the body finally believed the danger had passed. When the plane touched down, there was no applause this time, just the soft thud of rubber on runway and the ordinary sounds of arrival. Daniel welcomed the normalcy. He gathered his things, slowly. Joints, stiff muscles still sore, and followed the stream of passengers toward the terminal. The airport smelled like coffee and floor cleaner, and familiar impatience. Screens flashed arrivals and departures. People argued softly into phones. Life moved on, relentless and indifferent, exactly as it always did. Daniel liked that. He stepped through the sliding doors and saw them immediately. His mother stood near the railing, one hand gripping her purse strap, the other resting on Claire's shoulder. Claire bounced on her toes, scanning every face that came through. When she saw him, she froze for half a second, disbelief catching up to hope. Then she ran. Daniel dropped his bag just in time. Claire collided with him full force, arms wrapping around his waist, face pressed into his jacket. He held her tight, tighter than usual, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, the unmistakable proof that he was here, that he had come back. "You're squishing me," she said, muffled but laughing. "I know," Daniel replied. He didn't loosen his grip. "I know." His mother stood a few steps away, tears streaming freely now, her composure finally breaking. She had raised him to keep his head down, to work twice as hard, to never expect fairness, but always demand dignity. She took his face in her hands, searching for injury, for something she could fix. "My son," she whispered. "My brave boy." Daniel shook his head gently. "I just did my job." She looked at him the way only a mother could, seeing past the words to the truth beneath. "You did more than that," she said. "You came home." That night after dinner and homework, and the long, familiar routine of bedtime, Daniel sat on the edge of Claire's bed, watching her eyelids grow heavy. The room glowed softly from a nightlight shaped like a moon. "Dad," she said. "Fighting sleep. Grandma says you were on TV." Daniel smiled faintly. "That doesn't mean much. They said you were a hero." He brushed her hair back from her forehead. "Heroes don't always look the way people expect," he said. "And most of them are just people doing what needs to be done." Claire yawned. "I'm glad it was you." Daniel swallowed. "Me too." When she finally drifted off, her breathing slow and even, Daniel sat there for a long time listening. The house creaked softly around him. Outside a car passed. Somewhere a dog barked. Ordinary sounds, grounding and real. He thought about the night in the sky. The weight of the controls, the voices in the cabin, the anger that had flared and the restraint that had followed. He thought about how close it had all come to ending differently. The next weeks brought meetings and statements and quiet acknowledgements, a letter from the airline formal and grateful, a call from a regulator respectful and precise, an invitation to speak that he politely declined. Daniel answered what he needed to answer and ignored the rest. At work, things changed in subtle ways. Co-workers who had once nodded without seeing him now lingered to talk. Supervisors listened a little longer. Daniel noticed, but he did not let it change how he carried himself. Respect earned through crisis was still respect, but it was not the foundation he wanted to build his life on. What mattered was the morning routine. Breakfast together, walks to school, Claire's endless questions about how things worked, about why people did what they did. One afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table, working through math homework, Claire looked up suddenly. "Dad," she said, pencil tapping against the paper. "Were you scared on the plane?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He considered the question the way he had learned to consider decisions fully and without shortcuts. "Yes," he said finally. "I was." Claire nodded, satisfied. Okay. That was all she needed. Not a legend, not a performance. Just the truth. Daniel understood something then that he had not fully grasped before. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to stay present when fear tried to pull you away, to choose responsibility over comfort, to act without knowing how the story would end. He had not stepped forward to prove anything. He had stepped forward because the moment demanded it, because someone had to, because going home meant more than staying safe. The world would keep arguing about what that night meant, about who deserved credit, about what should have happened. Daniel let them argue. He had no interest in winning debates he had not entered. He knew who he was, a father who kept his promises, a man who did not look away when things got hard, someone who understood that dignity was not given. It was practiced. One evening after Claire had gone to bed, Daniel stood by the window and looked up at the sky. It was clear that night stars sharp against the dark. For a moment he felt the old pull the memory of altitude and silence and control. Then he turned away satisfied. He did not need the sky to define him anymore. He had something better waiting in the next room. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that real strength often looks quiet and unexpected, take a moment to like and subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments with 3 simple words. I see you.